Okay, so today we're going to be taking a look at how to create a very basic web server using Leverage as the base system for installing each different route and handling your server. I'm doing this because I get a lot of questions about what the heck is Leverage, like how do I use it, where do I draw the line between a plugin, a component, a service, and so on. So what we're going to be doing is taking a simple example of an HTTP server, and we're going to be building it together, and I'll go step by step explaining how each part of Leverage works, how I decide what to call different pieces, and how you can take that information and transfer it to a more complex application. Okay, first of all, hi, I am Jake. I wrote Leverage, so hopefully my words have a little bit of meaning here. Like I said, we're going to be creating an HTTP server. So what you'll need to do is start on a new project, and we'll just go ahead and do an yarn init-y, and that will give us a package JSON to work with so we can install our packages. Because we're working with Leverage, we need to install the core Leverage library. So we'll go ahead and say yarn add @leverage/core. And yarn is going to run and grab that dependency and install it for you. While that's happening, we can go ahead and make a new file over here in our project, and we'll just call that index.js. We're not really going to have a complex structure. We're not going to be doing anything crazy, so normal JavaScript is fine, and just one file is okay. You should know that Leverage is built with TypeScript, so you will get type completions if you're in VS Code or an editor that has support for that. And if you're using TypeScript, you will also benefit from those typings. But we're just going to be writing in JavaScript for simplicity's sake. And so once this is installed, there we go. And now we have a little node modules folder in our project. It looks like VS Code didn't want to update. There we go. Okay. So now we have node modules, and there's a bunch of stuff here, but the important part is that we have Leverage installed now. You can see the Leverage core library, and here's the actual JavaScript that was downloaded. And it does come with that type definition file, so you can see all the different types. Or you can always head over to the GitHub repository over here and take a look at the actual source and all the typings itself. And we'll be going back and forth between those to talk about different pieces of the library and how to use them. So we're going to be making a HTTP server, and that means we're going to need an HTTP plugin for Leverage. We'll start by using a predefined one, so one that I've already created, and later we can talk about how you would create your own plugin, because that's a very big part of Leverage in defining your own interactions. So for now, we can use a pre-created one by just installing @leverage/plugin-http, and then we'll go fetch that as well. And now with both of those, we have everything we need to create an HTTP server and run it. Okay. So in our index.js, we're going to import both of those libraries. Okay, now I'm writing in just regular JavaScript that's not being compiled to a past version, so I have to use the old school requires. But if you are writing in TypeScript, or if you're using ES6 syntax and all of those niceties, you can go ahead and just use the import statements. But what I'm going to do here is just import Leverage by saying const leverage equals require @leverage/core. There we go. And then next, I'm going to import that HTTP plugin by just saying HTTP equals require @leverage/plugin HTTP. There we go. And now that I have both of those, let's just go ahead and log out to make sure that we have everything we expect. So let me just log Leverage itself, and we should see some stuff pop up when we run this. So I'm going to go ahead and say node index.js. There we go. And we see everything that Leverage has brought with it. We are given a manager, which is a very important concept in Leverage, and then all of the different unit constructors, the plugin, the service, component, and middleware. Right? All of these are delivered to you from the core library. Okay? So the first one we need to talk about is the manager. Okay, the manager is sort of the central point in leverage, and it is the thing that will mediate all of your different units. When I say unit, I'm talking about one of these four things: a plugin, a service, component, or middleware. Now, leverage itself is more of a paradigm, a way of writing your code. It's very declarative and object-oriented. What we try and do is describe our application and then pass it off to leverage to put all the pieces together, and it will do the rest. Okay, so the manager is that part that puts everything together and will take every piece of your application and wire them up for you. So let's go ahead and create a new manager. And we're going to do that. I'm just going to destructure this a little bit so that I'm only pulling out the pieces of leverage that I want. So I'm going to say manager here. So all I'm doing is importing the leverage library and pulling out that one manager, the one manager key in here that we saw logged out. So I'm just grabbing this, and it's just a constructor function. To create our own manager, we're just going to call new on that. So I'll say const manager. Oops, it looks like I've deleted this. Const manager equals new manager. There we go. I'm just taking the constructor over here and calling new on it, saying let's get a new manager. All right, now that we have a new manager, we can go ahead and add things to it. So I am going to take our HTTP plugin over here, and let's go ahead and instantiate a new HTTP instance and add that to our manager. Okay, so I'm going to say const HTTP in lowercase is a new HTTP instance. All right, so I've gone created both of those. I'm just going to format it a little bit. And then we can go ahead and say manager dot, and you'll see the TypeScript completion that I was talking about. We have a couple of options. In leverage, I did add these four specific pieces in the manager, and they're more just kind of nice to haves and are abstracted to this little add function. So for the most part, 99% of the time when you're dealing with leverage, you're going to only call manager.add. If you're doing some more complex things, you might want to use these functions, but for the most part, you'll just call add and pass it any possible unit. And you'll see that it accepts any of these unit types: a plugin, a service, nothing, a component, or a middleware. And for our purposes, we're using a plugin, right? Our HTTP plugin. So I can just go ahead and pass it off our HTTP plugin, and it will work. So let's go ahead and run node again. HTTP is not a constructor. Let's go ahead and see what's going on. I'm sure that that's some ES6 nonsense happening. So bear with me just one moment. I am doing all of this live because editing is not my forte. So I'm just going to log it out and let's see what happens. Okay, it looks like I needed to grab the default export from here, and that makes sense. This plugin is, again, developed in TypeScript, and it's exporting a default export. It just has to do with the difference between the common JS module system and the new module system. So it's just a little JavaScript craziness, as is expected. So thankfully, to fix that, all I have to do is come up to HTTP and actually just destructure this. There we go. Not much change, and this time it will work. There we go. So it ran as expected. We didn't get an error. We didn't log anything out also. What we can actually do here is log out our instance itself, and this will show us what the unit looks like. We can finally see what the heck a unit is if you've not written any code for leverage before. You see a bunch of stuff here from this app property, and that's more of an implementation detail. That's not really part of the unit, but you do see a config, and that's a very big deal for leverage. You see a config, you see some plugin services objects that are not used currently, and then you see the two biggest pieces of leverage, is and type. So let's go take a look at the documentation for leverage really quick. And what we're going to do is take a peek at the wiki, and I want to show you the component structure. Now, this is one kind of unit, And what is written here will mostly apply to every other unit in Leverage. All but, I think, services use this exact structure. So a unit is an object that Leverage recognizes. And when I say Leverage recognizes something, I mean the manager knows how to take it and wire it up to everything else. Because that's how Leverage works. We work with predefined objects where we know the types and we know what kinds of objects we're dealing with. And that's how Leverage does all of its magic. So each unit is going to have this is property that will tell it what kind of unit we're dealing with. So for a component, we'll say it is a component. For a plugin, like we just saw, you'll see that it is a plugin. And for all the other kinds, you'll also see things like is service and is middleware. And that's just so Leverage knows what we're dealing with. Now, each unit is also going to have a type. The only difference here is in services. This will be called name, but don't worry about that too much. That's down the road. You won't need services for a while. But all your units are going to have this type that tells them what kind of thing they're dealing with. Now, in our case, what we're dealing with is HTTP. So if I log out this HTTP instance right here, this unit, I can see that the type is HTTP. And in fact, a really cool thing is that each unit can have more than one type. Maybe you have a unit that needs HTTP and it also does WebSockets. You can roll those into one and work together on one single object, which is really cool. Or you could break them up and have multiple units that do each job individually. That's up to you. But each unit will have an is and a type. And that's how Leverage knows what to do with it. All right. Now that we've talked about plugins, let's go ahead and create a component, because components are really what bring life to plugins. A plugin is just something, some kind of interaction that can be configured later. For instance, HTTP. We understand that HTTP is going to have a server, and that's what the plugin itself implements. But we need some configuration for that server. We need to know what kinds of routes to have. We need to know what to render. We need to know if there's any extra steps or any configuration done on the server itself. And so that's what components are. A component lets us configure a plugin for one specific case of its interaction. All right. So what we're going to do is write a component that will be given to Leverage for our HTTP server to render one route. All right. So let's go ahead and say we'll create a component. And again, Leverage units are just objects. So you don't have to do anything special to create them. You can use the constructor functions that Leverage provides to make things a little bit easier, but you don't have to. Instead, what you can do is just create a regular object and just add those properties we were talking about. You can say component is a component. You can say the type is HTTP. All right, very good. And now, finally, one last thing that needs to happen is for certain plugins that require some sort of action taken later, we're going to add a callback for this component. Okay. So how this is going to work is when we hand this off to Leverage, it will plug this into our HTTP plugin, right? It'll hand it off so that it can be installed to our server. And then when a route is called, we're going to want our component here to render something specific. We're going to want to render out maybe like a hello world or something like that. So we need to do two pieces to make that work. One is telling it what route it needs to listen to, and the other is actually the callback to be called when that route is hit, when a user requests that route. So the first part of telling our HTTP plugin what route to listen to, we can do by adding config, which is a Leverage property. This is defined in the manager and all that stuff. And so when you create this config, it's handed off to each plugin. And now I can say my config for HTTP is going to be route / and method get. If I remember correctly, these are actually the defaults, so I wouldn't need to do this in a hello world, but when you get to more advanced things, you can request any route you want. All right, so now we've told our HTTP plugin what route we're listening to. Now we need to define what happens when that route is called. And if you've ever used Express before, this is the same idea. Heck, if you've ever used the native Node.js included HTTP library, it's the same idea here. We have a function that receives a request object and a response object, and we can act upon those. So let's just go ahead and say response dot, let's see, what is it? I think it's like dot write or something. We'll see if I get this right. Dot write, hello world, maybe it's dot send. I never remember. That's okay though. It'll only work one time. That's all we need. So now what we're going to do, scroll down here so we can see our stuff, is run our application, okay? And you'll see something happens. That's something being nothing because we've only handed off our HTTP plugin to leverage. So what we need to do now is actually also add our component. So we'll say component over here. And now we've added both of them. And last but not least is for this HTTP plugin, this is an implementation detail. You don't need to worry about this for every plugin or component or anything you're doing. I've set it up so that this HTTP plugin does not start listening on a port, doesn't start the server up until you tell it to. So let's just go ahead and say listen 8080 and hope that port is open so that we can go hit it. Let's see. Expected, looks like route is named path. That's my bad. So let's try one more time. There we go. So we got nothing logged out here, but it is still running. So let's go ahead and take a peek. Open up a new tab and we can go to localhost 8080. Hello world. There we go. So we have just used leverage the HTTP plugin to take our own component for a route, start up a server, and it renders it out. And you can compose this with a bunch of other components, and you can build up a very large application using this structure. So now what if I want to define a plugin myself? Let's say I wanted to recreate this HTTP plugin. Well, let's go ahead and do that. So we'll kill our application just by pressing Control-C. And let's head over here and just install Express. So let's just say yarn add Express. And now what we're going to do is remove this piece and this piece. All right, so we removed our HTTP plugin. It no longer exists. And I'm just going to combine this row here with this. So HTTP is currently undefined, but we're going to go ahead and define that right now. So I have my component here, and let's go ahead and say HTTP is another leverage instance, or leverage unit, apologies, and it is a plugin this time. I mentioned earlier that a plugin defines some kind of interaction. It is the concept of interacting with something. And it doesn't have to be the outside world. It can all happen on your computer, but it's something that can be configured, some interaction that can take a configuration and use that to change what it does. Okay, so I'm going to make a plugin and say the type is HTTP, all right? And now you'll notice that before we had a component with type HTTP, and we were using an installed plugin from before. This name is totally arbitrary. You can create plugins and components that use any type. The only piece in a leverage unit that is not arbitrary is the is right here. There's only 4 predefined names that can go in here, and that's each name for each unit type. And that would be, of course, component, plugin, service, and middleware. So let's head back to our HTTP plugin that we're creating. So what you need to do here is offer an install method to install components. This plugin needs to accept configuration somehow, and that's done by having a method named the same thing as the type, actually just the same way that we did for the component. So what we're going to do is add HTTP here, and this accepts a component. All right, this is any component that is installed into Leverage that has this same type. That's important. Okay, so now what we're going to go ahead and do is install that into our server in whatever way necessary. Before we actually add it, let's go ahead and create an Express server so that we have something to install it on. So I'll say Express equals require Express. Very good. And we can head down here, and let's actually just put it up here where we're declaring some new stuff. So we'll say app equals Express, making a new Express instance, and this is just kind of how Express works. If you haven't dealt with it before, just know that this app is a server. Okay, we're creating a new server. And what we're going to do here is say app. Now, normally, when you're using Express, you define everything with like, if I want to add a route and I want it to be a GET request, I can say app.get my route and then offer some callback. Okay, what we're going to do is make this a little more dynamic by saying app, selecting that GET from our component.config http .method here. And of course you can destructure all your stuff and make your code a little bit smaller. Don't worry too much about this. But we're getting this information from our component. We're expecting each config to have that HTTP property, right, config.http, and then have a method associated, which is the appropriate method to call. All right, so we're saying call that method, in our case get, and we'll give that the component.config.http.path, right? We're saying get slash, so it's just the same thing that I've written out here, but it's pulling all the information from our component up here, from the actual unit itself. And this, of course, only happens when we install it into Leverage. Don't mistake this component value right here for this same one defined here. It only gets called when we install to Leverage. So that'll only happen, that'll only happen right here. And then finally, we need one more argument for the callback. And this one's easy. It's going to be component.http. And it formatted for me, thank you. Shoutouts to Prettier. And this HTTP function is just this method that is sitting on our unit. And so all in all, this should actually be everything we need to do to make this happen, aside from starting our server listening on a port. And let's just go ahead and add a listen method over here. We'll listen for a port. And all we're going to do is say app.listen port. Done. And now we didn't actually have to change any of our Leverage code over here. We just in place redefined our plugin from the one we were importing, and instead decided we're going to be using this one over here. Let's go ahead and run it. Again, no output, but it's still running. So we'll head back over, and now if I open up a new tab just for the sake of completeness. Oh, it looks like something may have gone wrong. Interesting. None of this was pre-planned, so this is the first time I'm seeing it. Okay, let's try one more time. It looks like we have a bug somewhere, so let's go ahead and take a look for that. I wonder if we stop using Leverage for a second, and instead we just go ahead and say app.get slash, oh, I wonder if it was because of my little demo code. let's find out. So I'll stop our thing by pressing Control-C, and I'll just start Node up again. And I have to remember to start listening on a port so that our server keeps running. Okay. Now, finally. Okay, so it does look like my little demo code was the issue. So I'll just undo a few times and remove this line right here, which was apparently overriding my previous and never actually ending the request. Or at least that's my guess anyway. Let's try it one more time. Hello world, there we are. Apologies for the broken code, but you get the idea of being able to define your own plugin very, very quickly and actually just offering your own drop-in replacement for any other plugin. And you can do the same thing for any other kind of interaction. If you want to create WebSockets, if you want to offer a system for web components, you can create a plugin that accepts configuration for all of those different cases. All right, this is not limited to HTTP, and your components are not limited to just functions or just configuration. And there are a lot of other different things that are offered in Leverage, like services and middleware that you can use to further advance your application and make things a lot easier to develop for. The whole idea behind Leverage is that you get to break down your application into these different sequestered pieces. You have plugins, which define an interaction and accept configuration. Components, which are configuration and one specific use case of an interaction that get plugged in to your plugins. You have middleware that is used to further customize your plugins. These are pieces that are only for plugins and define a modification to your plugin at some point. Then we also have services, which are used for cross-unit communication, which is really cool. And you can have each unit conversing with the same service or just some sort of interaction that doesn't necessarily need to be a component or plugin. It can be a service. And it's very, very useful in Leverage to break up your whole application into these different pieces, these different units. So if we take a peek at the code over here again, I'm going to walk through very, very quickly and briefly how Leverage is sort of set up and take a look at the actual code in it, because there's not a lot at all. There's a bunch of different files, but that's mostly because I really like organizing things. So don't be afraid at all of any of that stuff. The actual core of Leverage, the index.js, just exports all of our stuff. It's not very bad. It's 90% type definitions, so you don't need to worry about a lot of the code in here. If we take a look at the manager, which is, again, that central piece in Leverage, we can look at index.ts, which just exports our manager. So we'll take a look at our manager. Okay, so our manager conforms, again, to this interface that we saw earlier when I went over in my editor and said manager dot here. And that's how these get populated. If you haven't dealt with TypeScript, any interface or type, anytime you see those words, that's not JavaScript. It is actually just a type definition. So our manager itself can also be replaced if you write your own manager that conforms to these interfaces. So a manager is very, very simple in that it offers an add method that accepts some units and then goes through each unit and makes sure that it's valid, instantiates it if it needs it. You're allowed to pass a class to Leverage as manager, and it will instantiate it for you. Otherwise, you can do like we were doing before and just give it regular old objects. And then once it is instantiated, we go ahead and add each necessary piece. So if you hand off a plugin to our manager, we'll add the plugin. If you add a component, we'll add the component, and so on. So if we take a look at the actual add component over here, there's a lot of little checks that are being done, but nothing actually very crazy. Essentially, all we're doing for each unit is checking to see that everything that unit depends on, for example, a plugin or a service, is already installed, and if it is, then we go ahead and install our unit as well. So it may seem a little complicated looking at this code, but all that's happening is when we install this component to Leverage, Leverage is going to make sure before anything that we have an HTTP plugin, because without an HTTP plugin, this component doesn't make any sense. So while we are installing things in the correct order here, what I could actually do is install component first and then add my plugin later, because Leverage will hold this component until a plugin is available for it, and then this component will be installed. So if I kill our app and then restart it, it will work in just the same way, because Leverage is smart enough. See, I refresh there. I'll open this in a new tab. Leverage is smart enough to know that this component needs an HTTP plugin, but one isn't available just yet. So instead, it waits until we have an HTTP plugin, and then we'll install the components. And this works the same way for everything else. Anything that is dependent upon by a unit will cause that unit to wait on install until it is available. All right, so that's the manager. That's actually all it does. It just connects everything together. When I pass off this HTTP plugin, Leverage holds it. And when I hand off this component, Leverage passes it off to my install method on my plugin if it's available. All right, if we go take a look at the component definition, it's way simpler. All a component is an object that conforms to an interface. That's actually all it is. And this is the same way for every other unit. Every single unit is just an object that conforms to an interface. If we go ahead and take a look, let's say at middleware, which is something we haven't used yet, but you can know how to use it just by looking at the type. You can say, oh, well, it looks like a middleware unit is actually just your regular old Leverage unit, has an is, a type, and a possible config. I mentioned how this config in our code was part of Leverage. This is defined as something you can add to units to further customize how they interact with your plugins. And it works the same way for example, the service, which is another thing we have not used, and it is the fourth and final Leverage unit here. There's only 4 of them, thankfully. And the only difference here is actually this one key is not named type, it's called name. And that's it. You now know how to use Leverage. You now know how to plug things together, if only components and plugins. Middleware and services are also very useful, and I will do a video on them in the future if there is interest. Otherwise, you can go ahead and submit a new issue to the GitHub repository. Again, the link has been up here, and I will paste it in the description. Thank you very much for watching, and have a wonderful rest of your day.